further ado, let's get to the first question, which comes from David Stewart. And David was asking, hello, I'm working on my repertoire with the black pieces, and I realized that I don't see much 1d4 and 2c4. Sure, so I like the Queen's Gambit declined, which means I need to figure out something for the main lines. I have a good idea against the Catalan because I already played that as white, and I have d4, d5, c4, e6. Let me put that on the board. d4, d5, c4, e6, and we're going to be looking at this from black's point of view. Knight f3, knight f6, and knight c3, bishop b4. I'm comfortable playing for a Carlsbad in the exchange, so with like c takes d5, e takes d5, this structure with c6. But what are black's main plans after bishop to g5 on move 4? So for bishop g5, something like this, or perhaps white could also start with this one, and then black could play knight f6 here, and then white could play bishop g5 here, without trading on d5. So yeah, definitely a classic approach from white to develop the bishop out to g5, just setting up a simple pin, developing the bishop before developing the second bishop with e3 and not blocking in this one, you know, on the c1 square. So very, very natural for white to kind of develop this bishop early on and then try to play e3 and slowly get all the pieces out. So not much theory, right, that black has to know here. I'm just going to recommend like a really simple setup that I think lots of people can use, and I think this can last you a very, very long time. So if we want to play like a classic approach, I think the simplest would be to put the bishop on e7, and you can do this in, of course, many different variations. And from here, the plan is to castle and eventually fianchetto the other bishop, because this is really always going to be the main issue for black in a lot of queen pawn openings, is where to put the light squared bishop. The dark squared bishop, just based on the structure, is always going to be kind of a happy camper here, but the light squared bishop not so much. But black's idea is to just play b6 and fianchetto the bishop and eventually fight for the center with c5. And one way or another, the bishop on b7 will open up. Either white will take on d5 or black will just take on c4 at some point, and the bishop will have a nice open diagonal. So for example, let's say white just develops, or e3 here would be very, very similar. Castles, e3. A lot of players like to throw in h6, which I think is a very reasonable idea. You kind of put the question to white's bishop, and you ask if white wants to trade on f6 and give up the bishop immediately, or to back up with bishop to h4, and then kind of now giving black the option to play g5. Not that you should play g5 in this position. I think in general this is kind of a weakening move, but it's nice that you always have the option. But from here, I think black should continue with this plan of putting the bishop on b7, and then again playing for c5 and fighting for the center. So the knight can often go to d7 here, and then the rook can come to c8. But yeah, in general, black is trying to play c5. How much you prepare it really just depends on what white does here and what kind of moves they make. But in general, bishop b7, knight d7, c5. Black has, I think, a really, really healthy position. And yeah, in general, this is a very healthy setup that you can use against pretty much lots and lots of different setups that white can throw at you. This is a pretty classic and I think very, very playable development scheme for black. So yeah, one kind of interesting detail I want to mention is that at some point white might be tempted to take on d5, and how black recaptures on d5, this is always kind of typical strategic decision that black will have to figure out here. But a very common approach is to take with the knight to kind of encourage black, or encourage white to trade off more pieces, which kind of simplifies black's position. But also the idea is to kind of keep the diagonal open. So if bishop takes e7 here, for example, let's say knight takes e7, and then we want to put the bishop on b7, we're going to put the knight on d7, and then again we're playing for c5. So this pawn break, c7 to c5, regardless of how the structure changes, this is going to be like the main idea for black in this kind of position, which is kind of the main point I want to convey. Like without playing c5, then white is always kind of comfortable here because they have a little bit more space. But once black gets c5 in, then that's how black kind of equalizes in the center. Okay. Let's see here. So yeah, David, hopefully that answers your question. Obviously there's lots of different like moves that white can throw you, but in general you're just following the all the typical principles of chess: developing, controlling the center, castling, fighting for the center, and then once you get into the middle game, well, it's all about still getting your pieces out, connecting your rooks, again fighting for the center. And yeah, very, very classic position. You know, lots of like you know, tons and tons of games in like the World Championships feature this kind of position. Like players like Capablanca, Alekhine, just like just so many world champions have played this kind of structures, either with white or with black. And yeah, a lot of classic games to study and look at from these positions. So you're definitely playing some very classic stuff. Is this the Tartakower variation? You know, I'm not fully up to date with what these lines are called. To me, it's just like a classic. I just just think of it as like a classic Queen's Gambit declined. But I have heard Tartakower thrown around, so that kind of makes sense. But yeah, I don't know for sure exactly. There was a question earlier. If white plays bishop g5 on move 4, does it matter at all which knight develops on move 3? I think it does kind of matter because black has more or less options. So for example, if let's say knight f3 and bishop g5, and let's say black played bishop b4 check, and then here white would have like a second option to go knight d2, which I think would be kind of an interesting move because then white is avoiding like these double pawns after knight c3 and future bishop takes c3. I mean, here we're essentially transposing to like Rogozin or Nimzo-Indian or whatever. But with knight d2, this is kind of a second option for white. But if black is just playing bishop e7, then it doesn't really make a huge difference. I think the knight is best placed on c3, and to put it on d2 would be, I think, a bit of a concession for white. So even this position, bishop b4 check knight d2, I mean, I think is totally acceptable for black. So yeah, but whether white plays like knight c3 or knight f3, I mean, of course, this comes up a lot for d4 players, and there are different lines where like, yeah, if black is playing like this kind of thing, and whether white has like knight f3 or knight c3, like here white has the option of like e4, which is pretty sharp, which they wouldn't have. But on the other hand, if you start with this one, then you have like queen c2, for example, for white, which is like considered you know, a very reasonable move that you wouldn't have if you developed the knight to c3. You'd have to do something else. So yeah, there are definitely lots of different lines, like according to that are based on like, yeah, whether white starts with knight f3 or knight c3. And it's definitely a big repertoire decision that d4 players have to make. Of course, the biggest decision is what to do in this position for white, right? Like this is kind of the classic this is the classic question. This will be a question, I think, for centuries. I don't think, if chess is solved, maybe one day we'll be able to answer this question, because of course here it's like the move knight c3 is kind of the most natural move, and it gives you the most flexibility as white against most everything that black can do. But it allows the Nimzo-Indian, which is pretty much just like one of the ultimate most solid openings, you know, unbeatable openings. And if white instead plays like knight f3, which avoids the Nimzo-Indian, because then white can put something on d2, well, then the knight is committed to f3, and now everything else is like, white is now committed with the knight to f3 here. White is now committed here. Can't play like the most aggressive lines, and so on. So yeah, it's a classic question, but I don't know. I mean, I've been playing d4 for many years. Eventually, you just end up playing both moves a lot and kind of get experience all over the place. Though I've mainly been a knight f3 player in recent years.